and welcome to this session on OpenActive, an initiative which is founded by Sport England and stewarded by the ODI and UK Active. I'm pleased to introduce you Izzy Champion, who is the Data and Innovation Manager at Sport England. Izzy joined Sport England 2 years ago in a newly created role focusing on how data could drive innovation in the sport and physical activity sector. She's currently responsible for creating new partnerships, as well as the OpenActive initiative, which you will hear a little bit more in a second. Izzy previously also worked at the Open Data Institute and is passionate about how better data can help reduce inequality in society. Without further ado, on to Izzy to hear more about OpenActive.
Thank you, Orsola. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to share our journey on OpenActive, a sport and physical activity focused open data ecosystem that aims to help people move more and improve their health and well-being. We've been on this journey since 2012, and we'd love to share with you what we've learned along the way and where we're headed next. For those of you who haven't heard about Sport England, we're an arm's length body of DCMS, and we use funding from the National Lottery, reinvesting the proceeds back into grassroots sports and physical activity. We do this in lots of ways, as an investor, but also with our expertise and insights. This is our vision. We want everyone in England, regardless of age, background, or level of ability, to feel able to engage in sport and physical activity. There is overwhelming evidence for the life-changing benefits of being active, from childhood through to old age. Every year, these benefits deliver billions of pounds of value to our healthcare systems, society, and the economy. We know that being physically active enriches lives, builds stronger communities, and creates a healthier and happier nation. Next slide, please. There we go, sorry, apologies for that. As an organisation, we gather a lot of data about how active people are using a nationally representative survey called Active Lives, and we've continued to do this during COVID. Before lockdown, we know about 16.8 million people were doing less than 150 minutes of moderate intensity activity, a definition that comes from the Chief Medical Officer's guidelines. And unfortunately, lockdown is making it increasingly difficult for people to get active. During the first week of lockdown, we saw a real drop. 41% of people were doing less activity than before the restrictions came into play. And our latest survey results released last week show that this is getting worse during the current lockdown restrictions. Less than a quarter of adults are now regularly active with the current restrictions, down from 29% a month ago. This is the specific problem we're trying to solve. Finding the right activity is just too painful. In April 2019, we commissioned Comres to undertake a survey, and it showed that it's twice as easy to order a takeaway than it is to book physical activity online. We also know from our campaign work, This Girl Can campaign has proved that we can change the perception of what it means for women to be active, but they still tell us when they go to find practical solutions, it's just too hard. In the times of COVID and the rise of online offers that have proliferated, it's even more critical. People are spending more time online, and that means their expectations of finding opportunities is ever increased. This is a problem we've been aware of since 2012, but we didn't start with open data. Around the time of the 2012 London Olympics, we piloted with UK Active a single place or website for consumers to find and book sport. It was seen as a critical enabler of the interest that was going to be generated off the back of the Olympics, and also responded to earlier research we had commissioned from Nielsen and McCann, which showed that the experience of booking sport online was just not as good as doing things like booking a holiday. This one-stop shop was called SPoko, Sport on the Go. It was a single website from the whole country. Here's a screenshot of what it looked like back in 2013. And the pilot achieved big things at the time. It was the biggest searchable sport and physical activity database in the country, with over 320,000 searches undertaken by consumers and over 6,000 registered users. The search widget was embedded into 48 different websites, including providing data to the BBC Things to Do website, NHS Choices, and Change for Life. This reduced duplication in data collection, saving all these organisations time and money. We also work with our national governing bodies of sport, or NGBs. We've promoted several of their participation programs using digital marketing campaigns and bloggers and influencers like you and Thomas. And we also integrated, cleansed and updated their data sets from clubs. This helped them find unaffiliated clubs, which could ultimately result in additional income for them. Whilst it might simply be remembered as a website, underpinning it were data management and digital marketing services that also helped build capacity and capability into the sector around digital in ways that just hadn't happened previously. We really learnt a lot from SPoko, and that 1-year pilot, we started to explore longer term options, but unfortunately, we just weren't able to find a supplier within budget and whose approach would not place too much risk on us as an organisation. There are kind of 3 takeaways that I think are really important. The first is that sustainability is challenging. SPoko aimed to create a single website for consumers to find and book physical activity online. But the marketing cost to ensure all of England was aware of SPoko was super prohibitive and not sustainable over the long term. It was also just became clear that there was no one size fits all for consumers. It was just too limiting. A digital product or service that works for someone who's already active is unlikely to provide the right experience for someone who's taking their first steps into activity. We also learned that the data needed to create SPoko, the times, the locations, the prices of activity, amongst other things, was not available in high enough quality to ensure a really good experience for the consumer. We know that this data is super critical to consumers, and we know we needed to look at other models to make it available in a format that our sector could use. So we took all the learnings from SPoko, and we knew we needed to think differently about solving the problem. In 2016, we started having conversations with the Open Data Institute. They were supporting a number of startups who were also passionate about solving the problem of getting more people active. There was this existing community of early advocates, including organisations like IMIN and London Sport, who really cared about this problem. We developed together this OpenActive initiative. It was designed to develop data standards and open up more data within the sector. Our strategy towards an active nation set out a clear aspiration to work with the ODI to promote the principles of open and shared data for the sport and physical activity sector. In November 2016, we started a formal partnership with the ODI to develop what has become known as OpenActive. We even announced our shared commitment at this very summit. I think it's important at this stage to set out what OpenActive is. It's got a lot of different parts to it, but 3 of the key ones are: firstly, data standards and tools. We have created data standards that cover opportunities to join sessions and events, both physically and virtually, facilities, routes, accessibility requirements, and being able to book through third-party sites. We've also got loads of tools, both technical, like validators for the standards, but also things around e-learning for data literacy, guidance and advocacy support, and templates that make it easy for organisations to make OpenActive a reality. A second key part of the OpenActive ecosystem is our community. We've got a whole range of like-minded individuals and organisations, those who provide activities like leisure operators, intermediaries and data users, and a dedicated team of people within the ODI and UK Active. This community is really diverse. It started really sports specific, but it's grown to include new businesses and startups. These people are the powerhouse of what makes OpenActive work. We've also collated lots of evidence along the way, things like case studies from various organisations, both around publishing that data and using that data. And there's a lot of evidence about what works and what doesn't. But it's also important to see what it's not. So OpenActive is not a database of activities or one single app. Instead, there are lots of API feeds that organisations have published opportunity data through, which make it possible for others to integrate this data in lots of ways. And it's grown from the days of SPoko. It's not one activity finder. The data is in fact being used by lots of different activity finders, all of which are aimed to meet different audience needs. We also know it's not the only thing that's going to make it easy for consumers to find the right activities for them, unfortunately. However, our learnings from SPoko show us that this strong data foundation is absolutely critical to ensure the innovation required for people to create amazing front-end experiences for consumers. And we've been on this journey since 2016. We started without a blueprint, but we knew that educating people about open data and developing the standards would be absolutely critical. We also knew that starting from the perspective of the consumer would be challenging. Most data ecosystems at that time had started from the perspective of the sector and worked out using regulation. Things like open banking come to mind. And we started to think about how the value and the carrot needed would be so important to making this work. Demonstrating this value back is the most critical step, but also the hardest. But if you get it right, it can lead others to start that journey, encourage more data, higher quality data to be published and used. In the grand scheme of things, we're still at a pretty early stage. We've only gone through this loop a couple of times, and we're still in the progress of working with the community to demonstrate this value, but we are starting to look at what we need to underpin the sustainability of this initiative long term. This isn't to say we haven't achieved a lot, we have. This initiative has grown from 8 early advocates to over 100 organisations who consider themselves part of the community. And here are some kind of key stats to kind of talk you through how we stand today. This is not to mention the development of 2 versions of the opportunity data specification standards, 1 version of the booking standard, and the development of all those tools and guidance that I just talked you through. There's some really interesting learnings about how we've kind of come to this from where we started back in 2016. So the first is that data standards can't on their own guarantee quality. While some of the data might meet the data standards, it might not be of good enough quality from a consumer perspective. For example, things have a free text description, but the actual description doesn't make sense. Or you've included pictures to show the different types of activity, but if all your pictures are the same, it might make it difficult for consumers to really see what they're signing up to. Our sector, the sport and physical activity sector, is incredibly fragmented, and this makes change really difficult. All these different organisations have different priorities, audiences, levels of technical skill. At the small end, you might have people still using pen and paper to take bookings over the phone, whereas others use big systems to manage timetables. And even if you got all the leisure operators around the table, and there are hundreds, you'd still only be representing around 30% of the market. This means that models like open banking are harder to implement. And the one thing we really learned is that generating momentum is super critical, but really hard without a stick. We now have a really good amount of data being published, but it's still hard to prove whether this is being used in ways that make it easier for the consumer to get active. And that's causing it sometimes to be seen as a nice to have rather than a must do. But open data is only one part of the puzzle. There are substantial barriers that as a sector we're kind of coming up against. First, whilst we've improved, coming from like a really basic data being published to over those 220,000 sessions a month, underinvestment in our sector in digital skills is systemic. At every level, there is a profound underinvestment and a lack of prioritization across these skills. And this is true across the different types of organizations within our sector. We also know that the case for data quality is stronger than ever, but the how remains a critical challenge. Data standards have really helped our sector to understand what good quality data could look like and how it can help engage consumers. But the practicalities of improving and maintaining this data are still hugely challenging for many in our sector, both technically and culturally. The other point is that innovation and digital are really seen as opportunities, but the change really rarely reaches the new audiences. The current innovation in our sector is really focused on the already active audiences. And often organizations can get up in kind of sexy buzzwords without really thinking about what good data and digital maturity looks like for them and their consumers and how to get there. Whilst we're still at the early stages of having enough open data and momentum to really demonstrate the value that it could deliver, we are starting to see some indications of how OpenActive could support people to move more. Some research done by Frontier Economics has estimated there's a 10 to 25% increase in participation per opportunity through publishing open data. And some organizations are seeing the benefits too. Everyone Active increased their customer base by 11,500 customers thanks to their data being used by MoveTB, and 95% of these had never been members before. I think this is really critical to show kind of how we're moving forward and how we're generating that value, not just for consumers, but also for our sector. As an organisation, Sport England is currently developing our new strategy. And so we've been doing lots of thinking about how the infrastructure we've created can grow and develop over the coming years. I've pulled out 3 key areas for what we see for what's next. The first is new and innovative solutions. Right now, the main use of this data is around activity finders, helping people find physical activity near them. We see this developing a lot, whether that's finding something to do with your kids, whether that's football practice or an arts class. Or we would also love it to be picked up as like a value add feature to sit alongside other services and websites. For example, what if a site like Airbnb brought these opportunities to their consumers? This could potentially drive both increased participation as well as additional value and a USP for their service. We also, like many sectors, have taken a big hit due to COVID, but we're trying to approach this as an opportunity for a reset. Given the importance we see for data quality as a sector and the increased importance of being visible online and being able to book to enable effective track and trace, we're seeing a real interest from across the sector to engage with data standards and build on these as a critical part of our COVID recovery. The most exciting one for me is starting to see this data infrastructure getting reused across different sectors to solve different problems. We've already started having conversations with people like Open Referral UK. We've seen some kind of exploration in similar areas like arts listings by the team at ULab set up by Nesta. And we've also seen some real interest around government from other government departments about how the reuse of these data standards could support the social prescribing agendas. Essentially, GPs or link workers prescribing activity to help a range of patients with things like physical or mental health problems. And there are already some really early pilots happening to explore how this could work. We'd love to see more of these examples, so if you can think of any amazing ways that you'd reuse the OpenActive data infrastructure, do get in touch. And on that note, I'd just like to say thank you for your attention and hand back to Orsola, and we'll have a discussion with some questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Izzy. It's a pleasure to have you here and for you to share a little bit more the learnings of running the program throughout the last couple of years. I'd like to kickstart as people warm up and put questions in the chat with one question, because during your presentation, you mentioned that Sport England is going to publish your new strategy very soon, and your role is not just on OpenActive, as I said at the very start, but on lots of different ways that data can help the physical activity sector. I'd love to know from you, what has Sport England, or how has OpenActive helped Sport England frame this new strategy in the context of data and digital and the opportunities?
So this is an interesting time for us because we actually included OpenActive in our current strategy, the one that's just coming to an end. And in that strategy, it was kind of named as its own pillar, its own thing to achieve for its own right. And I think what we've learned is that the data is not there to be kind of for its own benefit. It's about how it helps us as a sector, the different organizations within that, consumers, kind of achieve the aims that we want to achieve. So our current strategy, which is, there's a kind of consultation happening around it, and I'd really encourage anyone who's interested to check that out. We're kind of framing these kind of big problem areas that we see across the physical activity space. And for me, it's about how we can then link in the infrastructure and the tools that we've created to support solving or making progress towards solving some of those big inequalities and those big challenges. So it's kind of reframing it as this kind of catalyst for change rather than as an end in its own right.
That makes sense. Thank you. Thank you very much. And we're looking forward to hearing more about the strategy when it comes out and seeing how that fits in the bigger picture as well. We've got a question from the audience. On asking, what do you think can be done to help push this internationally? And by this, I think they mean OpenActive or the open data infrastructure created with it, to drive adoption in international tech companies?
Yeah, it's a really interesting challenge. I guess one of the limitations of being Sport England is that we are very limited in how our kind of influence can be used. We have a lot of influence in England, but not beyond it. So I think one area where I see some kind of potential for this is across the sector, we're seeing kind of new entrants to the market. For example, new booking systems coming into the UK, to England. And I think that's one area where we can start to see kind of that cross-fertilization happening, where as these new organizations kind of gain trackhold, they are looking at OpenActive and seeing how that is going to set them apart in a market that could also already be seen to be a bit well established, let's say. I think another one is kind of the benefit of having these standards and tools as openly licensed means there's actually nothing stopping people from picking this up and kind of running with it. In terms of how that's incentivized, I think it's demonstrating again that value that we see and showing that back to other sports councils, for example, so other organizations like Sport England or other kind of similar kind of leisure operators, let's say, in a different country. So we can start to see how it's working in England and demonstrate that back so that people see the benefit of kind of investing in this.
Thank you for that. And I think you make a really interesting point, which is one of the beautiful things about data is that a data infrastructure in itself doesn't have borders. Obviously, there is an element of adaptation when it comes to language or specific regulation. But in the case of OpenActive, in the data that we're talking about, it doesn't have any personal data, and so it is indeed quite scalable. So whoever asked the question, if you have any specific nation or country in mind that you think might be a good opportunity, please do let us know. We'd love to hear more about it. Moving on to the next question, picking up on a point you made about where the data infrastructure from OpenActive could be used and applied in other sectors. People ask if there are other sectors beyond the one that you already mentioned, so the use case of social prescribing or the culture one that you can think of where OpenActive data infrastructure could help or be interesting.
I mean, I personally can see loads of applications. I think one that is quite aligned, I guess, to Sport England's new strategy, I think, is around how this kind of information could help people move around a place more. So we kind of call it active travel. So how would you start encouraging people to cycle more or to walk more instead of taking a car, or even kind of incorporating more walking and cycling as part of a journey to wherever they're going. Now, part of the OpenActive data infrastructure is looking at routes. And although that's still in its kind of early days, I see some really interesting applications for that in, for example, you could see services like mapping services starting to pick up that kind of additional information and providing an extra richness to consumers that helps nudge them towards making more environmentally friendly choices, healthier choices. And so I feel like that's one area where there's kind of a really interesting crossover that would help us meet both, I guess, physical health objectives, but also objectives from across the transport space where they are trying to encourage more of this active travel.
Absolutely. And I think no other year has actually proven how much of that is becoming more and more important, as Josh said at the very beginning. So quite exciting to see how actually the mind shift, there is going to be a mind shift from thinking about physical activity as something that you do to becoming almost like a positive consequence of living a healthy lifestyle. So looking forward to hearing more about that and the root standard development. I've got another question around the audience, and if anyone is out there and would like to do something similar in a different sector. You mentioned some of the learnings from SPoko and how then you decided to go to apply a more decentralized approach. What would you say are the absolutely baby steps, first steps that someone in a different sector could do in order to create an open data infrastructure in the same way that OpenActive has done?
So I think, one of the challenges we really come up against, and I think we still come up against, is that our sector, as I've said, is just so fragmented. We've got kind of thousands potentially of like really small providers, and how do you kind of collect the data from them? So I think even if you look at the kind of the bigger providers, the kind of quality, as I said, was a real challenge. So I think one of the first steps would almost be to take a step back and really understand like who are going to be the data gatekeepers, let's call them, for your sector. Where is your kind of data maturity as a sector, and how is that different across the different organizations? Because I think you kind of need to know how long you're going to be in the data literacy part and how often you're going to have to repeat that conversation. Because I think for us, that was a real learning curve. I think we thought initially that we'd do a bit of data literacy and then we'd move on to like everyone would be convinced, or we just get all the data open. And it hasn't really happened like that. We're still now 4 years on having conversations all the time about what is OpenActive, what is open data, how do I kind of make this relevant to someone, given 95% of their time, let's say, is focused on managing a range of leisure centres. I think really taking that step back and kind of understanding where people's heads are at, I think would be really, really critical. That would be definitely the first step. And then probably just looking to see what else is out there, because I think from some of the things we're seeing now, there are similar initiatives. They're not exactly like OpenActive, and they might be trying to do something in a slightly different sector or for a slightly different purpose. But there's definitely other initiatives out there that we have learned a lot from. The few that I mentioned, I think with Open Referral, I think there's kind of like this interesting cross-pollination of ideas there that has been really interesting. So yeah, I would also recommend that for my two top tips.
Thank you very much for that. And I can totally agree with the point of both creating a community as well as thinking about the data skills and literacy, which is definitely an area that's been talked about a lot today, but it should definitely not be overlooked, because we are talking about data and data infrastructure in order to create a form of change, which is not necessarily technical. And so it's important to consider both aspects, and absolutely agree with that. I think we've got time for one last question. And I was wondering, because we do come across this quite a lot when people think about digital innovation in the sport and physical activity sector. People often think of wearables or smart devices, and what we're talking about here is a digital infrastructure. Do you find that there is a almost like a different perspective on what digital innovation means for the sector, and what's your opinion about the coexistence of this potentially slightly different perspective of which one is contributing to advancing the innovation from a digital point of view in the sector?
Yeah, I mean, I think these two different types of innovation definitely need to coexist. I don't think you can. I think you can probably, you don't really need to have one or the other. I think you can have both. I think for me, it's about who is impacted by those different types of innovation. I think where you see things like wearables or things like kind of e-exercise bikes and stuff like that, they are very much marketed and for like more affluent audience, typically white audience, typically more active audience. And where we see the inequalities in physical activity is that less women are taking part, less people of Black and minority ethnic groups are taking part. Those kind of less people with disabilities are taking part, and those inequalities overlap. And I think where something like the data infrastructure can take you to is looking at that picture more holistically and understanding where you have opportunity data and where you can actually start to pull out some of the types of sessions or the types of activities, or create something that's more specifically designed for those audiences. And I think that, for me and for us as an organization, is where a lot of the excitement is. Like, how do we use this kind of innovation in a way that supports overcoming some of those inequalities?
Thank you very much, Izzy. Unfortunately, we couldn't get to all the questions, so I'm very sorry about that. But if you are interested in finding out more about the OpenActive initiative, today we published a blog post on our website where you can take a look and get in touch if you have more specific questions. If you do think that you would like to get involved in the initiative or learn, like we said, how to potentially scale it in other use cases, please do email hello@openactive.io. That's hello@openactive.io, and we very much look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much, Izzy, for joining this conversation, and enjoy the rest of the event.
Thank you.